By 1965, the Rolling Stones were riding high. They had been catapulted from rising stars to international icons. They were no longer leaning on American blues covers, but writing their own material. Their last 3 singles had all hit #1 in the charts, but they were still searching for a creative identity. Keith Richards' guitar playing had evolved, and with it, something had clicked. The riffs he was now writing weren't simply accompaniment, they were the song. It modernised the American blues that it began with and made it palatable to a global audience. The fuzz, rhythm and rebellion of his guitar resonated with a generation searching for authenticity. While recording Aftermath, Keith would intentionally step back while sculpting the rhythmic foundation of the songs. Brian would shape them. Mick and Keith had built the structure, and Brian was the interior designer. Naturally, Brian Jones by now had gravitated to other instruments. Though he wasn't just experimenting for the sake of experimenting, it was for Brian Jones absolutely necessary. The guitar alone couldn't give him the vast freedom to colour songs emotionally or atmospherically. Besides, Mick and Keith had evolved their songwriting, but in doing so, the compositions now had sonic gaps that needed to be filled. With every instrument Brian played, his intention was to always evoke an emotion, playfulness, grief, melancholy or frailty. He coloured each song like an artist, adding textures, all the time careful not to tread over Keith's rhythmic guitar work. Brian's instrument could often be heard in between Mick's singing, almost as if this was Brian's voice singing with Mick. As a result, the tracks on the album will resemble nothing the group have previously recorded. Amazingly, the whole album, along with other tracks to be released as singles and appear on compilation albums, will be recorded in just 1 week. On the flip side, this period will see Brian's position as leader slip away for good. He would not take the loss of control lightly. His behaviour will become more erratic and problematic for the group. In the last year, he grew bitter towards Mick and Keith and therefore upped his drug use. Keith later stated, "It was at this time, writing, recording and performing stepped into a new league and Brian went off the rails." Though Brian was at his peak creatively, Bill Wyman later stated, "In the group, Brian became sad, isolated and obviously unhappy." In fact, after they released Satisfaction in '65, Brian's unhappiness had become much more noticeable. It was at this time Brian began playing the guitar less and less. Mick during this time was going through a rough period with his girlfriend Chrissy Shrimpton. The two had been together since 1963, but things were coming to an end. The album would feature scathing attacks towards her. Keith will have a rocky ride emotionally during this time. His girlfriend Linda Keith would leave him at the beginning of 1966. Heartbroken Keith will seek solace not with a new lover, but an old friend. Brian's relationship with Anita Pallenberg was passionate but volatile. Anita was fearless and independent. These were characteristics Brian had himself, though he could never hold on to. And finally, a rift between the Stones and their manager Andrew Oldham would now surface. Despite their personal feelings about him, professionally he was on point. At this time, he insisted they prioritise their albums over their singles. This is the story of the Rolling Stones' Aftermath.
It's just doing the best you can and putting everything you've got into it and hoping people will like it. There's no real secret to that. Either people do like it or they don't.
By December 1965, the Stones had completed their 4th tour of North America. It had been the largest yet and a massive financial success. Only problem, someone had stolen Brian's 12-string Rickenbacker. After the tour concluded, Brian and Keith took acid for the very first time. The group had now decided to record their next album in RCA Studios in Hollywood. The reason, it gave them crucial advantages: longer sessions, better gear, and most importantly for Brian, fewer time constraints. He'll be free to experiment with sonic textures without the limitations he'd faced at Regent Sound Studios. Regent had been cheap and accessible, basically a factory to churn out singles quickly. No playground for Brian's sonic exploration. For the production, Andrew Oldham was credited as producer, but he wasn't sitting at the desk adjusting EQ curves or setting compression levels. He relied heavily on sound engineers. Oldham was not a producer like George Martin, Phil Spector or Brian Wilson. he simply added his vision. Previously, he'd pushed for the sound to have more attitude, but the Stones had now outgrown that style. Dave Hassinger was assigned studio engineer. In practical terms, he was the producer. He would write on the album sleeve, "The group were real professionals and a gas to work with." Normally a project like this could have taken a group 6 months, but the Stones knew exactly what they wanted, and more importantly, they knew when they had it. This isn't to say they looked for perfection. The Stones went by feel. Hassinger later stated, "You could ignore a little mistake as long as it didn't disturb the feel or it wasn't distracting." The sessions were split between 3 days in December and 4 days in March. Before sessions began, Brian bought a Rickenbacker 36012 guitar. It was the same model Roger McGuinn and George Harrison played. He'd bought it to replace his stolen Rickenbacker. Brian also bought a Gibson Firebird and a Gibson Hummingbird. Keith purchased a Guild M65 Freshman. On the 3rd of December, recording for Aftermath begins with Mick's song Mother's Little Helper. The story revolves around a depressed housewife self-medicating. It's thought Keith first composed the rhythm during the British or American tours of 1965. Mick had wrote the opening line, "What a drag it is getting old." He then focused on joyless mothers and housewives taking Valium to get through the tedious day-to-day jobs. At this early stage of Mick and Keith's songwriting partnership, they would split the process right down the middle. Keith crafted the riffs, the chords on his guitar. Mick wrote the lyrics and vocal melody. Engineer Dave Hassinger would later admit the song was inspired by his wife. Someone during a session had wanted some downer pills, something mild. Hassinger rang his wife, who'd been prescribed Valium for anxiety. She bought some yellow Valium pills, and it got Mick thinking. The song was clearly inspired by the Kinks' well-respected man.
'Cause his world is built on punctuality, it never fails. Kids are different today, I hear every mother say.
The track Brian plays 12-string electric with a slide. Some have misinterpreted him as playing a sitar in the background. Brian was actually layering guitars mimicking an Eastern sound. Keith accompanies him on 12-string electric and 12-string acoustic. In the studio, Keith had felt the song needed something to make the track twang. Keith later stated, some of the tracks for the album, he would record 8 guitars that appear in the mix very low. This is most likely one of the songs he's referring to. Brian plays the slide with a jangly, psychedelic unease. It's far from comforting, it's nervy and anxious. Through the song, he repeats the phrase over and over, like mimicking the desperate routine of drug use. It was like another pill being swallowed without ever getting relief. The sitar-like quality of the guitar adds to the surreal world the narrator is living in. Keith's guitar is the backbone for everything to work off. It marches on, regardless, like a routine that must be followed no matter what. It backs up the dependency of the narrator, like someone going through motions they no longer question. The band, in fact, always struggled performing this song for live shows. Charlie later stated, "We often tried to perform Mother's Little Helper, but it's never been any good. It's either me not playing it right or Keith. It's never worked." Despite this, the band would perform it live on the Ed Sullivan Show. The song will not feature on the American release of Aftermath. It would appear as a B-side of a later single though. Next, they begin on the track Dontcha Bother Me. The story follows a man angry at others for imitating his style. In the song, Jagger states, "Pick your own mind and don't you touch mine." Heavily blues inspired, the track features Brian on slide guitar. He carefully plays in between mixed vocals. It's one of the last times Brian calls back to his Delta blues roots. Brian plays his Gibson Firebird while Keith accompanies laying down 2 rhythm guitars. Brian's slide is a second voice to Mick. It's defiant, as if he's backing up the vocals with the message, "Don't mess with me." Brian's slide doesn't always land cleanly on the notes. It hovers. It's about attitude rather than technical perfection. While Brian lashes out, Keith lays down a chugging blues rhythm guitar holding the momentum. It's way more grounded, as if in a state of cool control. Keith stated at the time, "Our previous sessions have been rush jobs. This time we were able to relax a little, take our time. Next, they begin on the track Going Home. The story follows a man who's been far away from home for too long, and his only wish is to go home and return to his girlfriend. Brian plays harp and harmonica, while Keith takes lead and rhythm guitar parts. Keith had written the riff while on their American tour in late 1965. During the session, they go through several takes, each lasting around 2.5 minutes. After the 6th, Andrew Oldham encourages everyone to keep playing. They do, and the track ends up 11 minutes long. They overdub other instruments, and the track is cut. Keith's guitar tremolo gives a dreamlike and disassociating quality. It backs up the narrator's detachment from his surroundings and wishes of being somewhere else. As the chorus kicks in, with Mick dreaming of going home, Keith begins picking the notes, echoing the aching longing of the narrator. Brian's harmonica is sparingly used, like a memory. It's also mixed low to emphasise the longing of the narrator. By this point, RCA Studios is surrounded night and day by fans. They wait outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of a Rolling Stone. Despite this, nothing interferes with the recording. The next track they begin, Take It or Leave It, was recorded on the insistence of Andrew Oldham. The Stones had written it a year previous and originally gave it to the Searchers. The Searchers recorded it, but it peaked at a disappointing 31. Oldham was now adamant they record it. He believed they could do a much better job. The story follows a man sick of the mixed messages and emotional games he's receiving. He's done negotiating with the simple message, take it or leave it. Brian plays the organ throughout, with Keith on 12-string acoustic. Andrew Oldham was obviously envisioning a Phil Spector-esque sound, which is achieved in the song. It sounds like a 50s ballad with the Spector broken but beautiful tone. Keith strums through the song with defiance but sincerity. He doesn't hit the strings with force but clarity. It echoes the narrator, who's emotionally worn down and basically saying, this is your last chance to be honest. Brian's organ is distant but a constant throughout. It's low down in the mix, as if part of the narrator knows the games won't end and is slowly walking away. At some point during recording, Brian goes to take a nap in the studio. Next, they begin on Think, the first track in which Mick addresses soon-to-be ex-girlfriend Chrissy Shrimpton. The narrator in the song asks for his lover to look back on their relationship, though he is suggesting the breakup is her fault. Keith plays his Epiphone Casino with the same fuzz tone he used in Satisfaction. Ironically, Keith used it rarely, the very person who'd made it popular. In fact, the only time he used this effect was when he wanted to have a horn section sound that he heard in his head. Keith also plays acoustically and obviously the lead guitar solo. Brian accompanies on rhythm on his Firebird. Keith's tight, sharp playing echoes the frustration the narrator has with his girlfriend. Keith presses more when Mick sings Think About the Future. Brian's stabbing lead fills feel like bursts of frustration that never resolve. Again, Brian is very careful when he chooses to play in the song. The next track they begin, Until They Break for Christmas, is titled 19th Nervous Breakdown. The story follows a woman who, despite being from a privileged background, is emotionally unstable. The track was taken from a phrase Mick used to describe one of the American tours of 1965. He joked the tour was his 19th nervous breakdown. Stones were all finding it hard to live up to the mental pressures of such demands, but Brian in particular was struggling.
Fame doesn't sit very comfortably on anyone's shoulders. But some people's shoulders doesn't seem to sit on at all, and he was one of them, and I don't think it suited him.
The song Keith plays his Epiphone Casino. Brian accompanies on his Firebird. Through the song, you will hear some basic guitar weaving between the two. Keith's guitar that aggressively comes in gives the impression of agitation and restlessness. The sharp staccato that concludes with a sharp bend echoes the narrator, who's barely keeping it together. It's claustrophobic and spiralling with no relief. Brian, in a role reversal, plays the backbone rhythm holding everything together. It's constant but unsettling, like someone holding it together while chaos is brewing. Mick was later dismissive of the song, stating, "It was not very thought out and not very good really." Following this, the Rolling Stones went home for Christmas. As 1966 began, though Brian was no longer leader of the band, he was still the face of the Rolling Stones. He dominated the group's photos and held audiences' attention during live shows. His natural charisma outshined Mick's prancing. To fans, Brian was the Stones. They assumed he was the sole creative force. This fact wasn't lost on Mick and Keith though. It annoyed them that Jagger-Richards' songwriting partnership wasn't recognised. Though, in all fairness, it was still in its infancy. It really began in early 1965. At this point, they were still finding their footing. Midway through 1965, Brian had met Anita Pallenberg. The two were now in a committed relationship. Mick's relationship with Chrissy Shrimpton was all but done, and Keith's relationship with Linda Keith was done. It was at this point Brian and Keith began using LSD heavily. It bonded the two. The fact they'd first taken it together weeks previous made them feel like comrades venturing into the unknown, with only the other person understanding this new high as it took over them. Brian and Keith became as close as they were in the old days. On the 4th of February, the Stones' next single, 19th Nervous Breakdown, is released. The single featured the ballad As Tears Go By on the B-side. Critics dismissed it as Mick trying to be Paul McCartney. The song will hit number 2 in the UK. 9 days later, the Stones appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. Brian appears exhausted and frail. Brian's drug use is increasing. Despite his contributions, he still feels he plays second fiddle to Mick and Keith. Keith told him the solution was simple: start writing songs himself. Keith later stated, "I said to Brian, well, all you've got to do is start to write some songs." But writing was not his forte. Also, writing songs by yourself is difficult. I've rarely written songs alone. My idea of fun is writing songs with Mick or someone else bouncing ideas off each other. My own ideas are like half a thing. I can yell at the mirror or the wall, but they come bouncing back. And it's not a lot of fun talking to the wall. That same month, Keith does an interview with the Enemy magazine. In it, he slates their manager Andrew Oldham, stating, "The Stones have become a project of his own ego." At this time, the Stones planned their album to be titled If You Could Walk on Water. A reference to Jesus walking on water, it symbolised their growth and confidence. Their record company Decca hated the title. They feared it would upset Christian groups. They flat out refused it. Without anything else in mind and feeling pressured, they quickly came up with Aftermath. Mick and Keith felt, seeing as the album was recorded while they were ending long-term relationships, and every song detailed that, it was appropriate. The title being the Aftermath after all is said and done. The first part of the album recorded, the Stones make TV appearances and record a New Zealand and Australia tour beginning February 18th. On the 6th of March, the Stones return to RCA Studios in Hollywood. They continue recording for the album, starting with the song Out of Time. This is the second scathing attack Mick wrote inspired by Chrissy Shrimpton. The story follows a young woman who decides to return to the boyfriend she's abandoned and been unfaithful to. Unfortunately for her, several years have passed and it's now too late. Time has gone. She is, as the lyric says, out of time. In the song, a former lover has no hesitation in telling her this. Brian Jones plays marimba and vibraphone. This was the first time Brian had played marimba on a Stones record, though he was best remembered for playing it on the later track Under My Thumb. The marimba was an African percussion instrument. It looked like a giant wooden xylophone. The sound it created though was much deeper, warmer, and most likely why Brian chose it, more mellow. The instrument had been rented by engineer Dave Hassinger. Keith plays both rhythm on electric and acoustic. Keith's guitar is steady, understated and calm. No anger or deep emotion. It echoes the narrator stating a truth. Brian's part on marimba is light and playful. It has a smug, mocking tone, as if he's making a joke of the situation. It was a classic Brian angle in Mick's expression to former lovers. During recording, Brian's marimba was mic'd, then mixed in production like a lead instrument. This again was typical Brian, taking a centuries-old instrument and having it electrified. Next, they begin on Lady Jane. Who exactly the song was written about remains a mystery even to Mick himself. Henry VIII's third wife, or possibly Lady Anne. Mick later said, "I don't really know what that was all about myself. All the names are historical, but it was really unconscious they should all fit together from the same period." Keith later stated, "To me, the song's very Elizabethan. There are a few places in England where people still speak that way." Obviously, the song was transformed by Brian's use of the dulcimer. The dulcimer was an English instrument, a flat piece of wood with banjo strings. It's played flat across your lap, either strummed or picked. Keith picks his guitar strings, creating the effect of a Renaissance dance, but with a tenderness. He doesn't push the emotion, he lets it unfold carefully. Brian's dulcimer comes in with a gentle shimmer, a simplistic strum. It gives a sorrowful ache to Mick's noble lyrics. As the song progresses, Brian's playing becomes more intricate. The song ends with the dulcimer not fading away, but more a gentle retreat. Keith later stated, Brian was getting into dulcimer then because he dug Richard Farina. Unbelievably, Brian had purchased a dulcimer only days previous. He practiced playing sat on the studio floor, strumming with a sharpened quill. Brian spent hours cross-legged on the studio floor, experimenting with the quill, a glass slide, and finger-picking to see what sound he liked. By the time they'd started the song, he could play it. It was a perfect example of Brian's ability to pick up any instrument and not just play it competently, but expressively. For the studio recording, Brian decided on a goose quill to strum the dulcimer. It produced a highly unusual but unique sound. It's also worth mentioning, at this point Keith could do several guitar parts, and so, in that area, Brian wasn't so much needed. Mick later stated, "I don't think Brian was necessarily shying away from the guitar, he just enjoyed being a colourist." While recording, they had difficulties amplifying Brian's dulcimer. It would also be very difficult to amplify for live performances. After the sessions had been wrapped up, Brian had fallen in love with the instrument. He contacted Vox and had them build him an electric dulcimer. Vox would complete an electric dulcimer just in time for their summer US tour. For this instrument, he would use a pick when performing live. When the Stones performed Lady Jane live on the Ed Sullivan Show, you can see Brian playing the instrument. Vox would make 6 more, but they were never commercially released. The song showcased a completely different side to the Stones. People even wondered if they'd written the song. It would later be released as the B-side to Mother's Little Helper. Next, they begin on the song It's Not Easy, another breakup song. This time the narrator is struggling with life now alone, the shift from a shared life to a solitary routine. He regrets taking his girlfriend for granted and the choices he made which brought him to this conclusion. Keith plays his Guild Freshman, as well as lead overdubs on his Gibson Firebird. Brian plays rhythm on his Firebird. Keith later commented on Brian's absence during some of these sessions, stating, "When he was there, he came to life and he was incredibly nimble. He could pick up any instrument and come up with something, but then we wouldn't see him." Keith plays short stabbing lead racked with uncertainty. The tension never eases, it simmers. Like he's constantly trying to adjust and feel at one, but never does. Brian's rhythm is constant but uncomfortable, like the narrator trying to shake off memories that won't go away. Next, they begin on Mick's third and most blatant scathing attack on Chrissy Shrimpton, simply titled Stupid Girl. The entire story is an attack on shallow women. It is one of the most controversial songs the Stones ever written. The sharp biting tone of Mick's vocals fit perfectly with the relentless chopping drums, the emotional equivalent of slamming a door repeatedly. Mick later stated, "Obviously I was having a bit of trouble. I wasn't in a good relationship." He blends acoustic rhythm with electric lead, while Brian adds the second electric lead part. Keith's clean guitar almost sounds silly in a clear mock. catchy but also smug, totally clean with no reverb, almost too clean. Brian's tone, slightly thinner, echoes the sarcasm. Next, they begin on the next track, simply titled Paint It Black. The meaning has been analysed endlessly, from mixed breakup to Chrissy Shrimpton, an LSD trip, a metaphor for death. What we do know is the narrator is feeling grief and loss. Throughout the song, he wants to erase all colour from the world. The song opens with the line, I see a red door and I want it painted black. Red, often being the symbol of life and love, the narrator cannot bear. The song, Brian would introduce the sitar. It gave the track a raga rock edge, fitting with the psychedelia of the times. Mick later stated, Brian's sitar gave the song a Turkish groove. One of Ravi Shankar's pupils taught Brian the basics of the instrument. During recording, the pupil was sat next to Brian coaching him. Though, rehearsals for the song went very bad. They couldn't seem to find the rhythm and feel. Bill Wyman sat down at the organ and basically said, no, it should go like this. Everybody played along and the painted black sound was born. He added the rhythm on his Gibson Hummingbird and overdubbed the lead on his Guild Freshman. When Brian's sitar first kicks in, it's hypnotic and meditative. By the end, it's disorientating and out of control, echoing the narrator's mind as if he's in despair. Keith's guitar is more dark and disturbing. He doesn't survive the darkness, he commands it. He's made peace with the shadows and walks purposely through them. It's an interesting contrast to how Keith and Brian act emotionally toward trauma, grief, and basically difficult situations. Brian doesn't control the darkness, he's swallowed by it. As the pressure builds, and Mick shouts, I want to see it painted black, black as night, black as coal. I want to see the sun blotted out from the sky. Brian seems to almost lose control of the instrument, like he's trying to escape the emotional weight. Keith doesn't flinch, he shows total fearlessness, walking through the fire. The song has been covered almost 400 times. It was later released as a single on May the 7th. It hit number 1 in both the US and the UK. Critics couldn't help but compare the song's use of the sitar to the Beatles. Brian was enraged at the idea he was imitating the band. He commented, "What utter rubbish. You might as well say we copy all the other groups because we play guitar." Next, they begin on Mick's fourth and final scathing attack. Under My Thumb details the story of a man once emotionally beaten down in a relationship who has now taken control and the roles have reversed. Brian again plays the marimba for the track, making excellent use of the instrument. It gave a playful, mischievous effect. Without it, the song most likely would have had a more biting, sharper edge. It's hard to believe Brian was not a trained percussionist. He'd not long picked up the instrument, and yet his phrasing was so precise, as if he'd been playing for years. Mick later stated, Brian was more like an all-round musician rather than a specialist guitar player. Now, we have to have hundreds of people to do all these jobs. It's really annoying. Brian was a very good dabbler. Keith plays the guitar parts, lead, acoustic, and even adds some fuzz bass. Keith's guitar is constant but not aggressive or mocking. It's relaxed, as if he's already won the battle. No need to try. Basically, he displays control, echoing the narrator's statement the tables have turned. Brian's marimba is playful, another mocking tone, Brian celebrating his victory in a smug way. At this time, the album cover for Aftermath was shot. This was actually the first of 2. The 5 were pictured sat blurred, all facing the camera except Keith. The design had been Andrew Oldham's idea to get in on the psychedelic movement. Brian was not happy with it at all. He did an interview after the album's release stating, "I don't like the cover Andrew did." Next, they begin on another breakup song titled High and Dry. The story, a role reversal for Mick. He follows a woman who has money and status, but when she finds out he's only with her for money, she leaves him for those reasons. Keith plays on a 12-string acoustic. Brian accompanies on harmonica. Keith's guitar chugs away the rhythm tight and biting. Though it doesn't plead or explain, it shrugs, more like someone already walking away halfway down the road. Brian's harmonica has a bright, unapologetic tone. It's nasal and clipped, not warm or melodic. Keith later stated, by this point, Brian was hanging around with basically anyone who would flatter him. It became annoying to him and Mick, so they'd make fun of him constantly. Of what him and Mick did, Keith said, it was really unforgivable, but we were under so much pressure too. I think we were all pretty ashamed of it. Keith had told Brian to write songs in order to squash the bitterness he felt towards Mick and Keith. But the problem was, now they were making fun of him so much, he thought anything he put forward would be dismissed. A friend of Brian's and fellow musician once stated, we were going to write a song together, but he chopped it, saying, if I take it into the studio, they'll mock it and won't use it. Bill Wyman backed up this statement, saying, Brian rarely touched the guitar at home. He was frightened to write anything through fear of being laughed at. Next, they begin on the song Flight 505. The story follows a man so unhappy with his life, he boards a flight to an unknown destination to start anew. The plane ends up crashing into the sea. Some people have perceived it as a bad drug trip, flying high to start and then crashing hard at the end. Others believed Mick was telling the story of the famous Buddy Holly plane crash. This was a myth, as their flight wasn't 505 and they crashed on land, not out at sea. 505, however, was the number of the flight the Stones took on their first US tour. Keith plays both rhythm and lead, supporting Brian on rhythm. Keith's busy guitar is a constant emotional shift throughout. He never settles on a constant unease, like the narrator searching for the answer. Brian's guitar cuts through rather than answers or finishes phrases. No help for the narrator, no answer, just more questions. Next, they begin on the introspective track, I Am Waiting. The story follows a person in suspense waiting with a conclusion that never comes. Not knowing what the story is the whole point of the song. The narrator himself never gets to find out. The guitars in the verse mimic the anxiety that's felt. The chorus mimics the emotional frustration of the narrator. Brian again plays dulcimer for the track, while Keith plays acoustic, overdubbing 3 parts. Keith's guitar begins gently, a repetitive pick that holds the song. It sounds so fragile that any weight could break it. Brian enters the song with a delicate chiming riff that dances around Keith's acoustic parts. Keith's acoustic gives a restless and uneasy sweet effect. Brian's dulcimer gives a fragile effect to Mick's uncertain lyrics. It acts like a quiet pulse throughout, a ghostly quality dominating the sound. Bill Wyman later stated, it was Brian's musical abilities that make those recordings sound much better than they might otherwise have done. Charlie later said, Brian wanted to be the centre of attention, but he wasn't. Ultimately, Charlie believes Brian's biggest agony was that he didn't have so much talent he could lead the band. Lastly, recording ends with the song What to Do. The story follows an unfulfilled man spending his time working, drinking, and talking to people he doesn't care about. I really don't know what to do is repeated like a mantra. Of all the tracks of the album, this was clearly the weakest. Amazing they would leave Paint It Black off the UK release and include this. Brian doesn't appear on the track whatsoever. Keith plays rhythm electric and acoustic. Keith's parts are like the musical equivalent of a shrug, very detached, with little effort to create an impression. No answer, no care, and obviously no solution in sight. With the album finished, the Stones embark on a European tour. While on tour, Decca released a compilation album titled The Rolling Stones' Big Hits, High Tide Green Grass. For the cover art, they shot photos at Franklin Canyon Park in Los Angeles. The idea was to capture a deeper, more serious Rolling Stones. The Stones were pictured by a small reservoir symbolising the group have stepped away from the chaos of their former music. As for the track listing, the intent by Decca was not just to show their best hits, but to show America how much they've progressed in such a short period. it was a commercial and critical success, hitting number 3 in the States. It showed, beyond the hit singles, they had more to offer. After the tour ends, Keith uses his new income to purchase a dilapidated Tudor manor house. It was, however, by total accident. Keith was driving through West Sussex, got lost, and came across Redlands. He pulled into the driveway to be greeted by the current owner, a retired Royal Navy Commodore. Keith apologised, explaining he was lost, and the man gave him directions. Afterwards, the man asked if Keith was interested in buying a house. Keith liked the idea. The house was secluded, steeped in English history. It didn't scream luxury and status, it screamed spiritual refuge. Mick at that point's sole intention was to show the world the group weren't just hitmakers, they were boundary-pushing artists. And as for Brian, his problems were only going to get worse. Aftermath was released on the 15th of April to massive critical acclaim. It hit number 1 in the UK, with critics calling the group masterminds. With its success, the Stones were elevated to the point they were being seriously compared to the Beatles. On reflection, the title Aftermath was far more fitting than Could You Walk on Water. The album had basically detailed the rollercoaster of emotions following the aftermath of a breakup. Aftermath was the group's first true artistic statement. Mick later confessed, "That was a real landmark record for me." Not that the Stones paused to bask in their success. They went straight back on the road and planned their next album to begin as soon as possible. Mick and Keith already not just wanted to match Aftermath but outgrow it. Mick in particular was intent on reframing the Stones as artists. Although Brian had more creative freedom, watching Mick and Keith grow and push ahead without him at the centre, he felt his sense of purpose was unravelling. He'd named the band, booked the gigs, and shaped their early sound, but now the group was like a rolling stone falling down a hill he couldn't control. Brian had lost his grip on the thing he created. For Mick and Keith, pushing forward wasn't just an ambition, it was survival. With such fierce competition, they couldn't slow down for anyone, not even Brian. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel, and if you wish to donate, it would be greatly appreciated. Just click the 3 symbols next to the video, then the thanks icon, and choose however much you wish to donate. Everything donated goes directly back into the channel to make better quality videos. As always, thank you for watching and stay tuned for the next video.